And we have 5 presentations. I will not read out the names of the speakers, etc. I will take them when we actually move from presentation to presentation. We will stick to the program, follow the program in the order they're set out.
Culture in the economy, plurality in class relations, etc. Coming onto the context of Tripura, we see that the partition of India and the resulting immigration of non-tribal population into Tripura in the post-independence period had a significant impact on the state's agrarian structure, particularly on tribal land. While we see that the immediate result of this immigration was the loss of tribal land, development of landed class among tribes in Tripura over the last few decades is a new and important feature of the state's agrarian structure. And this paper argues the importance of plurality of agrarian relations and its historical specificity in the study regions with a special focus on tribe-non-tribe relations. This work is based on our doctoral thesis and field studies in both Jharkhand and Tripura, more of a qualitative and historical work and ethnographic in nature. I'll request Avinash to take over from here.
So when we talk about idea of agrarian change, we mostly try to understand from the particularly from the impact of Green Revolution and those particularly to the agricultural progressive states. But there are not much studies, or comparatively so to say, I did not find any study that talked about understanding agrarian change in the context of a tribal region, particularly in the context of their local inhabitations in the terms of caste and tribe. There are a study in the context of I think Arunachal Pradesh by Barbara and Harris White, and understanding how agrarian change in the tribal regions have taken place. But in the context of Jharkhand, there are so many studies that talked about idea of tribal into the context of ethnicity, land, forest, and water rights. But how do we understand the idea of tribal peasantry? So for me, the idea of starting point is to take with the Andre Bete's article, Tribe as Peasant, which he conducted a field study, I think late in 1950s and 60s in Jharkhand on Munda tribe. So one of the key features that we have talked about is that in the existing literature, we find that studies by Alpa Shah has talked about Jharkhand embodies a kind of a non-capitalist agrarian relation, and also persistence of subsistence agriculture. But what I argue in my paper is that from the context of historical studies, because when we talk about agriculture, we need to also understand how the idea of history and in terms of ethnography provide us to understand the present situation of the change. So Prabhu Prasad Mahapatra's study has talked about land and credit market, land mortgage system from 1960 to 1950s, and how he has talked about the idea of Jharkhand and the villages are very much different. And also Jharkhand is very important in a way that it holds certain land statutory rights like Chota Nagpur tenancy rights, Santhal Pargana tenancy rights, and those aspects are very crucial to understand how the idea of land is so central in the context of agrarian scenarios among the tribe and non-tribe. The another unique aspect about Jharkhand is that the idea of understanding non-tribe could be categorized into two aspects. One is that how the idea of feudal landlords coming from the Bihar has created a kind of a landlordism in the field area of Palamu, which I'll talk about. And another is that how the artisan group of community who came along the tribes and who have no history of subjugations, and they also are confined into the SC or Dalit category. For example, communities like Swasis as weavers are very significant in population in that case in the field study. So for my study, what I have done is that I have done a comparative study of two districts. One is Kuti, which comes under the scheduled area of Jharkhand, where the enactment of land laws takes place, particularly Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act, and other is a Palamu, which has a history of landlordism and Maoist insurgencies. So when we talk about certain aspects of it, change karo. Yeah. Yeah, so what we find is that in order to understand the differences, another idea of key change is that the role of intermediaries. Generally in agrarian studies, we find that the role of intermediaries comes during the harvesting process, after the harvesting process. But what interests me in Jharkhand with my fieldwork is that coming of agriculture intermediaries during the cultivation cycle, and those intermediaries are confined into the state, both as old and new intermediaries, and then functioning of an NGO and the agriculture input companies. So what I have noticed is that with the coming of, and this interrelationship functions in the context of state NGO and the farmer, and NGOs functions through different federations and Mahila Mandals. So these are some of the key important points that we have noticed, particularly in Khuti also. What we see is that in Khuti region, we don't have any kind of a feudal land relationships as unlike the Palamu regions of Jharkhand. But the nature of agrarian change has mostly witnessed from shift from indigenous to high yielding variety seeds, particularly IR 34 and 64, and coming of watermelon and tomato cultivations. And NGO plays a very important role because it filtrates or funnels agriculture input companies and state program together and penetrates into the every household which state agriculture extension services could not provide. On the other hand, when we see about Palamu, we noticed that the coming of the feudal relations, the role of NGOs was very limited, and agri input companies has played itself role as through the market relations. So the key argument that we talked about is that in order to understand the agrarian change, it is important to document the plurality of villages, and Jharkhand is one such region that talks about the caste tribe amalgamation and how the nature takes place. Now I shift to Tripura.
I'll quickly talk about Tripura. I'll just take 3 minutes. The first thing I want to talk about Tripura is, if you look at the larger sociological anthropological literature, a homogeneous picture of tribe is presented that we see. But I try to show that if you look at 19th century onwards, and if you look at the society and economy, and I have looked at administrative reports of princely Tripura, we see that that picture of homogeneous tribe is a question. We see different modes of exploitation within princely Tripura, hierarchy, and those things. And we see the picture that we get is there is a differentiated tribe. There is no homogeneous tribe, and I critique this notion of homogeneous, unchanging, and differentiated tribe. Moving on to, I'll quickly skip this part, I'll come to the post-independence period. We see that right from the time of the partition of India, there is a wave of migration into Tripura, the non-tribal Bengalis, which significantly alters the agrarian structure of Tripura, mainly leading to loss of tribal land. While that was the case in 50s, say 60s and 70s, tribal land alienation was largely to non-tribals. We see that appropriation of such lands by tribals has also become a new phenomenon in the state of Tripura, and development of landed class among the tribes in Tripura over the last few decades is a new and important feature of the state's agrarian structure. And this has mainly taking place through mortgage and distress sale of land to fellow tribes within Tripura. Let's quickly. Yeah. So Tripura's agrarian structure in the post-independence period, I have tried to argue through some of my work and publications, it could be adequately described, wherein the non-tribal landlords and moneylenders exploited both tribal and non-tribal peasantry. Further, non-tribal landlords, moneylenders, and a section of tribals actively contributed to the alienation of tribal lands. There's also this recent study by Foundation of Agrarian Studies, 2019, by Professor Madhura Swaminathan and Ranjini in 3 villages of Tripura, that has also shown diversified incomes and clear socioeconomic differentiation in tribal villages of Tripura. I'll request Avinash to conclude.
Yeah. So the comparative analysis talks about, despite geographically Jharkhand and Tripura are situated in 2 different positions, but the nature of agrarian change are quite distinct, and that allows us to understand in the contemporary social science discourse, how do we understand the agrarian change, and particularly those regions which were not, so to say, as much benefited from the Green Revolution, but the presence of the market, the penetration of the NGOs, and certain the post-colonial certain idea of the state formation in terms of creating a class among the tribals allows us to understand the nature of agrarian change could be also be understood from the context of tribal and non-tribal communities in the local class relation aspects of it. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for
Specify. And then there's also an argument which has started in the 1980s during the political crisis that said there is an necessarily antagonistic relation between the Jat agrarian peasant and the merchant Baniya Khatri, Hindu Baniya Khatri merchants. Now, there is a grain of truth to all these arguments, and that is in fact the case. But I argue here that they also lack in some certain aspects. The first one is that there is a hint of cultural determinism in it. That this will always remain, that Jats will always remain agrarian, they cannot move out. There's also there's an aspect that I realize is that most of this research tends to come from a certain part of Punjab, which is the Malwa Punjab. And then there is, I also argue that it fails to link the distress and accumulation in Punjab. So there is a discussion about distress, and there is a little bit of a discussion about accumulation, but there is no research that links the two in the case of Punjab, relatively less. So what I do is that I do a comparative analysis of two regions in Punjab, the Macha and the Malwa. I'll show you in a while the two regions. And I conducted fieldwork in a village and a town each in these two regions. So that gives me a comparative picture. And secondly, I emphasize that while the presence or domination of the trading caste or the absence of that domination plays an important role in determining the diversification of rural landowning Jats, there's also an argument which we miss out in this is that of the uneven capitalist development under neoliberalism, which needs to also be included in our analysis of rural diversification, etc. And then I argue that while understanding capital accumulation is an important academic project in itself, it's also important that we link this study of accumulation to the study of distress in Punjab. So these are my very broadly my fieldwork sites. So the Malwa region is the south of Punjab. I conducted fieldwork in Sangrur district's Sunam block. I conducted fieldwork in the town of Sunam and a village which was close to Sunam. I call it Kisangad. And in the Majha region, I conducted fieldwork in Taran Taran and a village near Taran Taran, which I am calling Vyapargad. And there's a reason why I'm calling Kisangad and Vyapargad, so that we don't forget that Kisangad remains predominantly agrarian and Vyapargad has a more diversified portfolio among farmers. Theoretically, I'm drawing on Professor Barbara Harris-White's insights on social structures of accumulation and also her previous work alongside Professor John Harris in the 80s, which I somehow feel has not received enough attention. And I combine it with agrarian political analysis that I learned while I was at FAS, and also reading literature in agrarian political, and that has come from Journal of Agrarian Change, Journal of Peasant Studies, etc. And my methods were mixed. I used both quantitative surveys, I used secondary data sets, and also fieldwork data, and both qualitative and quantitative. I also collected caste profile of 800, almost 900 businesses in the two towns to look at the social structure of accumulation in these two regions. Right, coming straight to the evidence. So in the two villages, the point that I was making, in Kisangad, if you look, 44% of what I'm calling classes of capital, although I don't have much time to define what that is, but it includes capitalist farmers, landlords, but also those who have incomes from, let's say, immigration to global north countries. Right, so 44% of classes of capital in Kisangad were only dependent on agriculture and allied incomes. Further 32% were mainly agrarian but had some non-agrarian incomes. Now, in sharp contrast, Vyapargad had 54%, almost let's say 60% had predominantly non-agrarian incomes and as their base of accumulation. So these, so very diverse, very different kind of situation here, which kind of also, challenges or contradicts the notion that Jat Sikhs in Punjab don't diversify, that they remain agrarian, which I show that in Vyapargarh, they were indeed diversified. Okay. And if you look at within, okay, I'll skip this. Now, if we have to understand these differences in the basis of accumulation among Jat Sikhs in these two villages, I am going beyond the villages and I am bringing evidence on the social structures of accumulation in these two towns. First, I am presenting evidence on Sunam, which is in the Malwa region, and I am first using the data provided by Ministry of Corporate Affairs on registered companies data, which I am taking as a proxy of non-farm economy, very rough, very bad proxy, but still a proxy. And I look at the number of enterprises between 1970 to 2023, and I find out that 57% of these enterprises between 1970 and 2023 have been established by the trading caste, the Banyas and the Khatris of the region. Whereas for the Jat Sikhs, it's only 13%. This is in the Malwa region. Dalits were only like 1%, and the rest are the OBCs and other castes. And this is backed up by fieldwork evidence. So I collected evidence data on seven different businesses in Sunam, including rice mills, brick kilns, commission agents, petrol pumps, aisle centers. And I find out that 80% of these enterprises are still owned by Banyas and Khatris, mainly Banyas, but also Khatris. And if you look at the Taran region, which is the North Punjab region, Majha region, it's an entirely different picture. 55% of enterprises that I discussed, that I collected data on these 6 enterprises, were actually owned by peasant caste, the Jat Sikhs. And the share of trading caste has come down to almost 1/3. And this has started happening since the early 1980s, but it increased during the 1980s, during the political crisis when many Banyas and Khatris were pushed out of the region due to the militancy movement. Right. Now, it's easier to explain, it's easier to limit the explanation till here to say that the absence or presence of trading caste explains the rural basis of capital accumulation. But what we also miss out is on the fact is that there's uneven capitalist development in India under neoliberalism, which has brought growth to some regions more than others, and within Punjab it has brought growth to some regions more than others. So the Malwa region has been more or less excluded from the neoliberal growths, but the region near Amritsar, which is also the Amritsar, Taran Jandiala belt, has received relatively more growth. There's been an expansion of industry in this sector. There's been an expansion of gated communities, housing, but also it's been more integrated in the global value chains. This region in general. So if you look at, again, I'm using the registered company database as a proxy for non-farm economy. If you look at this, between 1970 and 2023, the Taran region has always had more number of enterprises than the Malwa region, than Sunam. And this was also backed up by fieldwork evidence in all the 6 sectors that are collected evidence on. The Taran region had more number of enterprises, and they were growing at a faster rate than in the Malwa region, right? So right, and so this is the crux of how I'm linking the diversification of basis of accumulation in the Majha region with the non-farm economy, both with uneven capitalist development as well as the social structure of accumulation in the towns. And if I have 2 more minutes. 1 minute. Okay. So there's also, and now I'm linking this accumulation, these differences in accumulation, basis of accumulation in the 2 villages, to the distress faced by laborers in these 2 villages, right? That's the link that I'm trying to make here. So the argument is that in the Malwa region, where there is a higher dependence on agriculture and allied activities for accumulation, which is also labor displacing, very labor displacing, it is this region that has emerged as the hotspot of agrarian crisis. The reason being that when there is an over competition among the landed classes, class castes, this has led to an increase in land prices, this has led to an increase in land rents, and this has also led to an increase in buffalo prices. And what that means is that the landless Dalits and the land poor Jat Sikh have not been able to increase their cultivation or increase their livestock, which could have helped them increase their incomes. And that is the reason so that the crisis is much more stronger in this region. Whereas in the Majha region, where there's been a more diversification of bases of accumulation, this has led to an adverse incorporation of the laboring classes in the informal economy. So they are going through a qualitatively different kind of crisis, a distress that has not received enough attention. They are the ones who are hyper exploited. They are the ones who are more precarious and more insecure in the informal economy. Right, and there's also gendered aspect to it, which I cannot go into right now. So just to conclude, provocation here that understanding agrarian change also requires going beyond the village, and this allows us fresh insights that we haven't received earlier. And there's also an argument that we must also move beyond the cultural factors in explaining what's happening in rural areas. We must also understand the social structures of accumulation and uneven capitalist development. Yes, all right. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Invite Aman Bardia to come up and do his presentation on caste, capital and contestation.
I'm a PhD candidate at the New School for Social Research in New York, and I want to thank FAS for the opportunity to present my work here. All the staff here, my chair, and my colleagues and friends. Thank you. So my paper's key premise is the entrenchment, not the transcendence of caste through capitalist agrarian change. So, the core idea here, the broader overarching thesis is that capitalism in India mobilizes caste rather than dissolving it. And my focus is looking at Gujarat to extrapolate that. So for some context, Gujarat has long occupied a paradoxical position in contemporary debates on agrarian change. It's been celebrated by policymakers as a laboratory of growth-oriented reforms, and at the same time it simultaneously occupies some of the sharpest fractures in caste and class divides in rural relations in the country, is what I contend. So over the past 3 decades, the region in Gujarat has witnessed a rapid transformation of its rural economy, acceleration of industrial corridors, there's a proliferation of capital-intensive and corporate forms of farming, and a consolidation, together with this rapid industrialization, of consolidation of far-right ethno-nationalist political bloc. And these shifts have occurred under the leadership of the Bharatiya Janata Party, whose dominance in Gujarat has provided an ideological and institutional scaffolding for capital accumulation on an unprecedented scale. And this transformation, I think, compels a renewed scrutiny because it touches what I contend to be a core inquiry animating agrarian political economy today. And suggests like how do advances in the forces of production reshape caste-class configurations and what new forms of contestation emerge in its wake. I contend that caste has been ignored by mass-based left movements at their own peril, and grounded research into explaining how caste and class manifest co-constitutively pushes a different political direction. It allows us to better evaluate the class differentiation of emerging working classes, the social structures that condition that emergence and development, and ultimately can help to sharpen a more effective political strategy of countering these oppressive social structures. Yeah. So, I mentioned some of these things, which is that like rather than dissolving older structures, the dynamism of productive forces in Gujarat has reinscribed caste power with the new class configuration, mechanization, contract farming, and propriety seed input regimes have intensified processes of differentiation. Land and credit have been concentrated in the hands of like caste-dominant agrarian elites, while Dalit and Adivasi households have experienced this possession, weight suppression, and expulsion into precarious labor circuits. So state policies and legal frameworks underwritten by the political dominance of the BJP and its networks have facilitated this accumulation. I mean, not like it wasn't happening under Congress, but these networks have been captured by BJP to consolidate them in I think a much more effective way on their own terms. So legitimizing it through narratives of growth double farmer incomes, make in India, development, and so on. So for governing Gujarat, I think, the question is why Gujarat, right? Like, so I think it allows us to make a double intervention, which is that first, I think it contributes to a more theoretically grounded and empirically informed critique of agrarian transitions in neoliberal India in a way that shows how caste operates as a constitutive infrastructure of capitalist accumulation rather than something that is residual, rather than something that is not a central feature of how capitalist development is unfolding in the countryside. And second, I think it situates Gujarat as a strategic site for interrogating convergence of three powerful forces. One is the intensification of productive forces through agribusiness and greater intensity and technological change, capital intensity. The reconfiguration of rural class relations under neoliberal reforms, and the consolidation of the ethno-nationalist political power, which together has really underwritten the Gujarat model, which has been gotten to the national scene since 2014. So to repeat the question, like how do advances in the forces of production reshape caste class configurations and what new forms of contestation emerge in their wake? I want to just preface this with a little remark, which is that I rely on secondary data. I have a small number of interviews and excellent guidance of my academic mentors, but I'm yet to do fieldwork. And the available data I use is more indicative than definitive. So relying on that. Then, yeah. So, yeah. I'm looking at particularly how land and credit flow is going towards dominant castes within agriculture, and it is in turn leading to a greater out-migration and dispossession of land. How these state policies and law do not function neutrally but actively facilitate and legitimize this accumulation. And I'm drawing on three major literatures. One is, of course, the history of critical agrarian studies, from Patnaik, Bernstein, Barres, Swaminathan. And the second is classical political economy traditions of Marx, Ricardo, Smith, and then Wake. And the third is caste studies from Ambedkar to Omved and the legacy of that. So together with that, the key argument is about how caste is not a pre-modern obstacle, it's the organizing principle of, it's an organizing principle of surplus extraction. For my methodology, I'm using a mixed methods approach, so I rely a lot on national sample surveys and census data. I was sifting through all the state budget and cooperative board records, and together with the legal files in the Gujarat High Court, Supreme Court cases, and some of the SEZ land acquisition disputes that were happening towards more western Gujarat, where there was a higher proliferation of special economic zones. I've been reviewing some of the parliamentary debates and government archives and triangulating them through the Gujarati press. So this is mostly what I'm going to. And I also looked at tender data of which corporations were. I will move forward and provide some vignettes of the empirical work that I've done to be able to. I think that would provide some indication of the direction I'm pointing to, and I think you can read my paper for looking at it more. I think it's uploaded. Okay. So I'll go over it a bit quickly. So from the 1980s to 2025, till today, so every major policy judicial shift in Gujarat in reconfiguring land access, tenancy, and accumulation has primarily benefited dominant caste players. In the 1980s, there was a progressive land reregulation that happened before it happened on a national scale in India, which started in the late 1980s. In 1995, Gujarat streamlined land conversion, and from 2001 onwards, the ceilings were relaxed and it led to a much bigger proliferation of corporate acquisitions of land in a much wider scale. Post 2004, Gujarat led the country in special economic zone land acquisition to such an extent that by 2014, greater than 25% of national SEZ land was in Gujarat. In 2020s, there were some tenancy reforms that attempted correction, but it still faces a lot of resistance on the ground, because there's a history of land reforms in Gujarat and Saurashtra before Gujarat was formed, and through the 1970s and 80s, there have been very significant land reforms for redistributing it along caste lines. But the issue has always been that it's been extremely difficult to impossible for people whom the land is redistributed to, the oppressed caste, to actually take it in practice. Because most of the networks of bureaucracy, of political power in rural areas are really dominated by upper caste political forces. And interestingly, a lot of the data that I was able to find was through, of land records and of the caste census, was through petitions in the Gujarat High Court, which were putting all of these land records together in a way that I couldn't access in the state archives. This is marginal land holdings by caste. So among SC and SC groups remain persistently high, with see SCs nearly holding 75%, that's marginal, that's less than 1 hectare of land by 2012, and STs up to 72%. They emphasize how Dalit Adivasi is not substantially reduced landlessness, even as dominant caste small holdings have increased. The land redistribution legislation post-1980s, it failed to benefit most vulnerable groups due to the reasons I mentioned, together with some legal loopholes and local resistance and policy evasion. That's been very predominant. I detail it much more in my paper. So interestingly, dominant caste show an increasing share of marginal holdings, but only as a secondary trend. The main story is still persistent exclusion. Contract farming, and here I'm focusing on potatoes and cotton, largely, and horticulture, which is pretty prominent, together with groundnut, but I'm looking at those three, prominent in Gujarat. They mainly benefit medium, large, and dominant caste holders, like Adivasi and Dalit smallholders face high entry barriers, risk, and repeated contract exclusion. And I was looking at some tender data and some agricultural processing export data that was provided in the Gujarat. You can just go to the government's website and find. Oh shit. Okay. I'm gonna fasten it up a little more, so probably these two will be the main vignettes. I put some it is wage data that largely also shows how contractual temporary labor is now the main source of income for landless Dalit and Adivasi households, and increasingly so. Then there is some, that's the interesting one too, cooperative credit flow by caste in Gujarat, which is showing how the absolute dominance of part of our upper OBC groups in formal cooperative credit distribution, while others left at the periphery. And that.
Can I suggest you move on to your conclusion?
Okay. I thought I would have more time because two people.
I'll give you more time on this list.
Okay. So Gujarat's model of growth is, in sum, is an exclusionary, politically entrenched strategy that's rooted in this dispossession and not a broad-based transformation. And I think it's very important to empirically show that. So technical reforms like land reforms, credits, subsidy provisions, special economic zone, it reinforces this exclusion unless they directly confront this caste structure channels and capital, labor, and power. So the myth of post-caste India, dismantled by this data, I think shows how caste power is mediated, not replaced by capitalist institutions. by cooperatives, by contracts, by state boards, by the corporate law that structures all this investment and accumulation flows. So the rural distress and protests, like for instance, the ones that happened in the past 10 years of like the Patidar reservation protests, the protests around Una, they connect back to these entrenched caste mediated inequities in market and policy channels. So my conclusion is like that lasting transformation for this must break the dominance of the caste-based public, private, and cooperative institutions as well. So the elite capture of land credit and policy is not just limited to Gujarat. I think it's been pushed to the national level, particularly much more intensively from 2014 onwards. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Say, these are all very good papers. We got, in principle, 5, in reality 3 papers, but it's absolutely worth reading the 2 others if they've been uploaded as well. They do give very fine-grained state-wise or comparative state-wise analysis that are absolutely worth reading. If I should say sort of one thing that is common among many of these papers, it is a strong analysis of the role that is played by either tribe or caste in accumulation and dispossession. I'm here quoting from Aman's paper from Gujarat, where he says, the evidence and arguments presented throughout this analysis lead to a sharp and disturbing conclusion. In Gujarat, caste is not a residual social category to be mitigated by capitalist development, but a central system of accumulation, retooled and intensified by neoliberal reform, state policy, and capitalist agrarian change. And I think a similar kind of argument is presented by Gaurav in his paper on Punjab. Whereas, of course, when we're looking at the Avinash and Saqib's paper, looking at the 2 Adivasi tribal, or if not dominated states, but states where these groups are strong, the conclusion is perhaps slightly different because it relates also to class differentiation within tribal populations. But it's certainly a clear analysis taking these categories, these social groups, very, very seriously. So that is one thing that I really thought stood out in this analysis. I'll now provide some comments and views on the different papers. I will start with just a brief comment on Jacob Josh's paper, even though he is not here, because I think his attempt to discuss the uneven pattern of capital intensification across regions in India, north, east, south, central, etc., is actually hugely interesting, looking at different degrees of profitability, different degrees of mechanization, and different degrees of labor intensity, and coming up with ideas or views based on his data of that there are different combinations of these, from distress mechanization to capitalist accumulation, to a mixture of accumulation, to accumulation driven by a mixture of labor-intensive agriculture and mechanization, etc. I can't say whether his conclusions are correct, but I can say they're certainly provocative and very interesting. So I would recommend people to have a look at that. Going on to the papers that were actually presented here, I'll just, as I say, just a few comments. I'll start with, I'll go through them in the order that I put them down here. So I will actually start with Gaurav Bansal's paper, looking at the 2 regions in Punjab and really looking at how we can understand class and caste and class accumulation and the conditions of the classes of labor. I think what is excellent here is of course, I would say so, going beyond the village in the study of these kind of relations. And this is unusual to see, and it's great to see, and I think Gaurav pulls it off. It is very clear, the patterns that he shows, the differences that he shows. And the link to what that means for Dalit laborers is also excellent. It's easy when you study capital to concentrate only on that, and it's great to see that that this paper does make the connection to what this means for a laborer, and in this case along class caste lines. There are some issues that I would have loved to have seen explored more, and that is the reasons, that relates to the reasons for these differences. And I know the paper has more than what you managed to put out here. Also, for example, that the period of Sikh armed activities and oppression of that meant that in the one region the Hindu traders disappeared, and in a sense left the space open for farmers to enter. And so I think that is interesting. I wonder, how much do you see that as the factor, and how much is it that the neoliberal growth trajectory differed in the two regions? As part of that, you mentioned that the agrarian conditions were poorer in Madhya, which is the region where the strongest move out of agriculture has been. So is that an important connection, or is it really, in this case, down to politics of the 1980s and only that? So how far can one sort of think beyond that, or is that where the thinking about the differences should stop? Avinash and Saqib, as I said, great to see, no I didn't say, but great to see a study on states where there's a strong tribal population. We have too little of that, of this, and it's so that in itself was a pleasure. Also nice to see collaboration between two scholars that have worked independently and then pull forces and make the most of it. And clearly a strong focus on history. I wonder though that with that strong focus on quite deep history, we're talking a major chunk of the history from before the turn from before 1908, for example. So this is quite deep history. Whether in doing that you are maybe missing out on prison sentences, because you can only do that much in a paper. For example, it is well known, or we heard Brenda Karat this morning talking about Adivasis losing out in agriculture and not becoming a proletariat. Now, we did not have any of the dispossession that has been ongoing in tribal areas for the last decades because of mining, etc. In this picture, it was about dispossession was only in Tripura when migrants took over land and when capital of tribal origin took over. But isn't there? I mean, it is quite standard to argue that there is those processes of dispossession that goes beyond internal within agriculture, but that affects agriculture quite significantly. And likewise, I don't think there's any mentioning of seasonal labor movements, which again, I mean, Jharkhand is, if not the home of seasonal labor movements in India. It's certainly one of the states where it's quite dominant, and that is to a large extent Adivasis. So I wonder if one seek to include those kind of patterns. To what extent do they link into the history you outline, and to what extent is it something else? So how does it fit into the picture that you're painting here? That would be interesting, I thought. Aman's paper on Gujarat. I mean, this is a paper which, in a sense, stands out for two reasons. The one is it is really seriously theoretically framed. And it's great to read a paper that has put time and effort into reading general literature and thought through the different theories and is putting it together. On the other hand, maybe the downside of that is that it is less strong empirically, and I know there's fieldwork to come. But that is where I would sort of situate it. Very strong conceptually. One could do more to make the argument empirically. Now, and I understand. I mean, one of the excellent things you've done is to look into judgments. So how the laws in Gujarat have changed to enable accumulation. But whether how much impact that had on the ground compared to in other states, I'm left wondering about, because I'm not told about other states. So I can see some impact in Gujarat, and I think only when it comes to land alienation for SECs is there reference to that it's more important in Gujarat than other states. But the other issues you deal with, there's no discussion of, is this unique for this Gujarat model, or is it actually just common in India? And this is another example of alienation and dominant caste capitalist accumulation at the cost of Dalits and Dalit workers, etc. And so that would be very interesting to know more about. And it's maybe something that could have been done more about also without fieldwork. But that to me is the main issue, because otherwise I think it's a very interesting paper, and I'm looking forward to see how this will develop further. Let me also just mention Baldev Singh and Ramandeep Kaur's paper, The Dynamics of Wealth Inequality in Rural Punjab, the comparative study of two villages, which is a detailed study based on detailed quantitative information that shows that inequality is increasing and looks at that along a number of parameters. It is solid, it's very interesting. It would have been interesting to maybe look more into why there were differences between the two villages. Of course, there is an attempt to explain it, but I think that could have gone further. But it's a very detailed and a great study that will enhance our understanding of development of inequality in this region as well. So I'll stop here, and I don't think you should try and answer these questions straight away, because if we do that, we will never get to the question and answer session. I think we should take a number of questions, and then we take a round where you answer as many of the questions, or those are the questions that you feel that you would like to answer. So that is how I would like to proceed. So the floor is open. Questions, please. There's one hand there.
The accident is okay, just what Ram mentioned it. So I had a question for all the presenters. Part of it is perhaps seeking more detail. When you have 10 minutes, there's only so much you can do. So on the Jharkhand and Tripura paper, so you spoke about the NGOs and other intermediaries. Could you please say a bit more about what it is that they do, how is it that they are shaping production relations, relations with exploitation, so on and so forth, and how does that then matter for gradient change of the kind that you sort of put it up in the presentation. And to Gaurav, so different sources of diversification, but I wonder in the, I think it was Manba where the bunnies move out. Is that right? Macha. Okay. So is it the case then that the Jats have been able to diversify into politics, for instance? So as a source of diversification, local politics, electoral politics, I'm not sure I saw it there because I'm sitting sort of here. So how important is politics being as a source of accumulation, gatekeeping, and sort of local power? And finally, Aman, sort of, I suppose, a bit of a provocative question before you go off to do fieldwork. And you mentioned Patla protest, for instance, for reservation. And I wonder in your model, because you're synthesizing different strands of literature, is there any way in that conceptual framework that you can account for class differentiation within a caste? Right? So you're seeing OBC sort of increasing demands, let us say, for Sarkari Naukri. This is across India. What might explain that? And one might think one of the reasons for that is that an elite stratum has actually been successful and a majority is not within a particular caste group. So while it is absolutely important that caste remains central to Indian capitalism, to modern India, so to say, how might we account for the differences within the caste? Because that might tell us something about how caste identity, how caste ideology is actually mobilized to create there's this appearance of homogeneity, right? Where it's possible for community leaders to then speak in terms of a caste identity and actually continue benefiting while the rest lose out. But thank you so much.
Okay, we continue to John up front.
Actually, it's largely anticipated my questions. I mean, but yes, you started with good remarks about character, the way in which the papers, in some ways, come together in an interesting way. I was sort of struck at the first two presentations, anyway, and the emphasis on regional specificity. This is so important, and I think we need to work much more on regional specifics. I too wanted to know more in the Jharkhand case about the role of the intermediaries that you're talking about, and I don't know whether it's you yet have material on this, but I would like to know much more than you were able to say, perhaps, or perhaps you don't yet have the material on what you mentioned about corporate penetration into agriculture in Gujarat. Okay, yeah. So it's both cases. Interested in intermediaries and in perhaps in corporate penetration. Gaurav, wonderful work. I think, like Jens, perhaps I would. Perhaps you have a little bit more time now to spell out a little bit more your arguments about the reasons for the variation between the two sides, which I think you didn't really quite have time to develop in the presentation.
So Venkatesh.
These are very. Can I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Will you put your hand up?
Yes, please.
Okay.
No,
No, these are very program, and it's very important. That is, when you say, and you did in your presentation, that Marxists are trying to understand the link between caste and class and all that, it's too sweeping an understanding. They want to distinguish between what individual Marxist scholars may or may not do and what Marxist movement on the ground do. Movement on the ground have to deal with the reality that they are contending with. And then they will look at the dominant caste, they look at the heterogeneity within dominant caste, and how exactly mobilization of forces across castes by some particular class, or alternatively fusion of caste and class in a democratic direction is also possible. So I think it's important not to simply make a sweeping remark on how Marxists fail to understand the relationship between caste and a class or the nature of capitalist production. I don't think that I can't speak for all Marxists, but I think that we don't necessarily see caste as a mere legacy, nor do we recognize that caste domination in particular sites can also facilitate particular forms of class domination. And I think is something that has to be empirically explored. You can't generalize. So you can't, you discussing the case of Gujarat, you have one dominant, but it's not clear to me whether the upper caste is a homogeneous upper caste that you're talking about, or there are multiple castes within that. Because it matters. Across the country, I mean, take Tamil Nadu, where we have some experience, there are areas where a particular caste may dominate, or an elite caste may dominate, but below that, middle castes are often mobilized to fight struggles on the ground. I mean, the long history of Eastern Java, for example, the backward caste Hindus and the Dalits fought together for the rights of both tenants and agricultural laborers. So these are possibilities that exist on the ground. But I think it's important not to run hastily into any kind of generalization. These are products of concrete conditions on the ground. And I think some humility is warranted when individual scholars take on concrete studies and want to explain them, not necessarily in grand systemic terms, but in terms of the reality that they encounter. It might be useful to stick to the reality you encounter before you make grand statements about caste and class and the position of various ideological strands. It takes time.
Thanks, Venkatesh. Thanks. And luckily we do have time for questions that also elaborate a bit. Could I just make sure that I've spotted everyone that have their hands up? Yes, I thought so. Exactly. Madhura first, and then in the back, and then there. Yes. No, it's Madhura first. Madhura first. Okay, whatever.
Coming from Jatsi, and the other one traditional Pandavania. Is there any difference between the surrounding villages and these local towns according to this the different composition? The Jatsi could dominate the new enterprises. Is there any big impact on surrounding villages? The workers, how they recruit workers, and or how they make affect certain relationship with the village, political situation to the local towns. Because your point is exactly the local town and village disconnection. And we had a very interesting experience about South Indian agriculture, which got to make a huge garment industry in southern cities. That's kind of magic, but I don't know. But is there any special characteristic in Jat enterprise, Jatsi enterprise compared to Banya? I'm sorry, I can't say clear English, but popular is something like that.
Thanks. Madhura.
And to Saqib, I know your work on Tripura, but is there a similar class differentiation among tribes in Jharkhand? Oh, I didn't get that. I didn't get that.
Yeah, okay. Behind.
In your field size, and if you don't, which it appears that you don't from your presentation, if you don't, then are you going all the way and calling it class caste then? Because I saw you use that term. I ask this question whenever class caste pops up because I find water class differentiation both in my field size, both within capital but more importantly within labor, which sort of relates to what Venkatesh was also talking about, the difficulty in bringing these castes together from a organization standpoint. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
All the comments one by one I'll try to address. Idea of understanding seasonal labor migration is very key component in my PhD because seasonal migration has brought remittance, and we know that the agriculture cycle in Jharkhand just happen once in a year and mostly it's paddy dominated. So and since land is intact to the tribals, so and the coming of NGO has actually brought this, because during the cultivation time, most of the migrant laborers come back because they have to engage for paddy cycle cultivation, and then they go back, and rest during the harvesting is mostly done by women and some portions by men. So remittance is one way through which I talk about the idea of seasonal migration. Another key component I have not talked about, the agrarian labor relations. The context of historical specificity allows us to understand different kind of agrarian relations, particularly one is a land mortgage system, other is a communal system of labor exchange, third is a sharecropping, and fourth is a daily wage labor relations. It all functions in a different time period with the coming of CNDA Act. One of the key components to summarize here is that for the key idea is that how arable expansions has happened with the coming of credit. So for non-tribal people, it was mostly into collecting the cash in the context of land mortgage. But for the tribal, after the CNDA, it was the context of expanding the agrarian cropping pattern. So that is one. Another thing is that to talk about the context of NGO. Before I chose the 2 districts, I have done a pilot study in the 5 districts of Jharkhand, and specifically the key main area to choose this Khuti and Palamu was to understand that these regions are progressively, in a way, people are cultivating into these agricultural practices, and no nearby vicinity are into the context of land dispossessions. So Khuti ka village is about the model village which was created by the NGO. So that allows me an advantage to understand that how NGO creates a model villages through which the cropping pattern and agrarian social structures keeps a change. So another key component is that how NGO functions. One thing is that most of the government programs and the studies have talked about that ki Adivasi keeps the state away in Jharkhand. Like if you see the study by Alba Shah and others. But what I have noticed is that it is quite difficult to say that Adivasi state really does not exist in the remotest locations of Jharkhand. So what is happening is that various government programs are infiltrated through the presence of NGOs, like Special Swarna Jayanti Garam Swarajgar Yojana. Then we have million well schemes. Those were the key schemes that has happened in the eastern regions. And under then I think sometime back, there is an initiative by the government by the name of bringing BREGI, bringing green revolution to eastern India. So there they have talked about how special, then all these government schemes have actually created. That is one. Another thing is that there is a lot of competitions among the agri input companies. So agri input companies actually mediate with the NGOs and the state so that they can, go into rural households. And I was surprised, even in the mud houses in the remotest location of Jharkhand, companies like Myco and Monsanto Seeds are advertising it. And they are also, targeting the gram sabhas of the villages on every Thursdays. Like they will come with a banner and they will come with the NGO professionals, and that is how they will try to do a capacity building. That is one aspect. Another aspect is that NGO functions through Mahila Mandals or the village federations, and they have a different categories of it. So they functions in a federation cluster and higher levels of it. And they have also created a seed cooperatives. So these are the reasons through which we find that there is a change from indigenous to the hybrid or high yielding variety seeds. And then now in a recent trend about vegetable and watermelon cultivation and marigold cultivation. But what is interesting about this thing is that... Yeah. So what is the interesting thing I wanted to talk about is that the regional specificity. Because in the Khuti region, we have a Maoist insurgencies, but they are splinter groups. We don't see a kind of a CPI-ML feudal against the feudal landlords happened in the Palamu region, which is close to Bihar. So, but what has happened is that in Palamu, illegally the land transfers has happened from Raj to the OBC, Yadavs and other Kurmis, but it has not gone to the Dalits and Adivasis. Whereas in Khuti, which is a Scheduled Area Act, no such things has happened because land is intact to the tribals. So this is what makes my study interesting. So thank you.
We have to stop here.
So the NGOs and the private sector companies
Exactly, yeah.
hand in hand.
Yeah, the NGO works as a funnel.
Excellent. Good. Well, so 30 seconds, that's all I can give you. This is your
I won't take more than 30 minutes. I just, not a response, but I just want to comment regarding the point on disposition. Now the thing in Northeast India especially is that even though you have disposition, you have land mortgage, you have transfers within the tribes, we are not saying that, and my study also does not say that tribe is becoming class. I say this because even though there is dispossession, there are land transfers from within the tribe, dominant tribe to another tribe. There is also very strong identity, tribal bonds and identity with regard to kinship relations, marriage. So it's a mix of class which is nascent or developing, but a very strong presence of tribal bond and identity. Thank you.
Thanks both for the statement and also for doing it so quickly. Thanks, Gaurav.
Thanks everyone for the wonderful comments. I'm very grateful to them, to you for this. I'm going to club Jens's and John's questions, comments, because they all, it's about the reasons with the differences. I think it didn't come out nicely in the presentation. So the literature tells us that the reason behind the differences in these two regions is mainly the presence or absence of trading caste in the non-farm economy, and the absence in the Majha is because of the militant movement in the 80s and early 90s. That is the dominant understanding, but I am also arguing that this sort of obscures the impact of neoliberal capitalism that has brought uneven capitalist development. So within India, Punjab has sort of excluded, Western India and Southern India have received more investments and more growth. So Punjab has been excluded, but within Punjab, the Malwa region has been excluded. Most of the Malwa region, except the GT belt region, the Grand Trunk Road belt region, the Ludhiana, Rajpura region, except that. So there's so both these reasons matter, the uneven capitalist development and the lack of but for me to quantify it, to say which one matters more it's not as much of a quantitative understanding for it. But I can say another aspect which would also connect to my answer to Deepa's question, is that there are also historical reasons behind this. So Majha region was directly governed by the British, whereas the Malwa region was indirectly governed by the British. So it had feudal landlords. So the Malwa region, especially Sangrur, Patiala, Nabha region, was it was like a zamindari region. So there was landlords, like feudal landlords, and it was also less deeply integrated within colonial capitalism, the global capitalism, the Malwa region, whereas the Majha region was more neatly integrated within global capitalism since the colonial period. So that also explains. Also, the Majha region also had more army recruitments. So the Majha region was the sword arm of the British army, whereas that was not the case in the Malwa. So the diversification of incomes in some way started much before, which has sort of continued now. Earlier it was mainly in army, but now it's also in trading, agro-processing, businesses, all kind of businesses basically now. Ashwin's question. So in Punjab's context, it's a little, Jat Sikhs are the only dominant caste. So there's no contestation in Punjab in that way. So politics is a complete Jat Sikh domination in general. Even though Dalits have entered politics, and there were local level leaders among Dalits in both my fieldwork region, politics still remains a Jat Sikh game. And that has, even in gatekeeping, like you said, especially in my Majha region, and that's a very contextual evidence, but in my Majha region, the gatekeeping by Jat Sikhs of a very few particular families, around 7 or 8 families, was much more stronger than gatekeeping in the Malwa region. But I am not going to say that this is that a regional difference, but that village level differences. I'm really sorry, but I probably misheard your question, but I'm going to try to answer that. I'm not sure, did you ask if it connects to labor, how these differences, how do they govern? So I don't have any systematic evidence on it, but I had interviewed 6 or 7 laboring class organizations in both these regions to ask these questions to them, right? How does it make a difference for laborers if Jat Sikhs are entering the businesses compared to if they are not? Both of them said that the domination of Jat Sikh is still very strong. But that was also because they were all dealing with their own regional context. So for in their understanding, I mean, in the Majha region, they were like the Jat Sikhs are worse in terms of managing labor compared to earlier Banyas. But when I went to the Malwa region, they were saying that Banyas are actually even like worse than others. So it's difficult to say who is bad. I think capital in general is bad, capitalist. Deepa, so there is class differentiation within caste groups, but this was more so in the Majha region, the North Punjab region. So 50 in the Majha region, the North Punjab region, 50% of Jats were laboring classes. In the Malwa region, only 20% of Jats were laboring classes. But when we talk about the classes of capital, in both these regions, it was the dominant caste who were the classes. Only 2% of 3% of classes of capital in Malwa were Dalits, and in Majha it was only 5%. So it's much more strong. The caste class is much more stronger at the top, not as much in the bottom, especially in the Majha region, one of the region, which is also more deeply integrated into global capitalism. So more precarity, more differentiation. Sorry, yes. I think that should answer all the questions. Sorry, thank you.
Thanks so much. And last speaker.
Thank you so much for the comments. I think they were really fruitful, and I think there's a lot of work I know I can do more in that direction. At the same time, I want to address some of those comments more directly. I'll club some of them. So the first one was from Ashwin, and you also, one second. Yeah, the class differentiation within caste. I think that's a really good point. I didn't get the chance to go into a bit more, but some of the graphs I was talking about, like there are these upper caste OBCs, and even within Patidars, there's a whole range of them. There's the Anjana Chaudhary Patidars, there's the Koli Patidars, which which aren't the dominant castes in various regions. So. But that's a good point. I haven't presented a broader differentiation of that within the paper itself, which I think I can expand on. The agitation for the Sarkari jobs part of it, that was largely upper class dominant Patidars that were leading the charge on that front. Then the comment on the sweeping remark regarding caste and class non-integration by Marxist mass movements, and that maybe it would be a result of individual Marxists that have been clumped together. I completely agree that there are a lot of histories of anti-caste and anti-capitalist Marxists fighting together, and there have been a very rich history of Dalit Marxists. And Marxist movements working together with Ambedkarite movements and integrating them. But at this, and I mean, I'm saying this more as a side remark because this is not something that's in my paper or in my research. I was kind of just framing it more as a motivation than a point of research by itself. And I can make a comment on that motivation, which is that I think the left is really on the back foot in this country. The place where I come from, Gujarat, there is very little of it to completely non-existent. And from the movements that I know that have been anti-caste, that have been involved with, not just in Gujarat but in other parts, they're extremely suspicious of any left movement. And there is a history to that. While that's not the only history, but I think it's very important to engage with that much more explicitly. Through the analysis of the way capitalism develops, that has caste as an essential component of how the development occurs, which itself then I think gives us a better strategy for addressing it if our understanding is based in that. So I think that's the core part of the motivation, but obviously I think the histories are much more variegated than I think I was able to present, and you're completely right about the humility part of it, and I think the left could use a lot of that precisely on that front. As the caste composition of cooperative credit societies. That's a really interesting question because I had to compile data from multiple sources, and obviously this is some of it is extrapolative, but not all of it, because you can obviously find the leadership of the boards of cooperative credit societies. There's a registrar of cooperative societies, Gujarat, RCS. It has a website which maintains district-wise list of cooperative societies. There's also something that's published biannually, a socio-economic review by the Gujarat government, that and the state explicitly tracks SC/ST membership targets in cooperative credit societies that you can acquire the list for. Vikas Rawal also has a really good paper on participation of the rural poor in dairy cooperatives, which particularly looks at dairy in Gujarat, and it tries to segment it by caste, about how much the participation happens. Gujarat also has a SC sub-plan, SC/SP, and it explicitly mentions share capital subsidy to SC/ST members in cooperative credit societies. So that shows that at least there's some administrative data that you can see how many SC/ST people have been enrolled that the government is required to keep. So I think I want to mention the preface that I made, that the data that I have put together is much more indicative than definitive for making these remarks. And the corporate penetration into agriculture in Gujarat. Well, so for that, the large thing that I'm looking at is the crop protection and agro input market. So input forms like seeds, agrochemicals, these are tenders that the state government gives out. And there are websites that you can directly look at who gets that tender. And there are some studies that analyze that further, looking at how, particularly in say central Gujarat, there's cotton. But you're right. I think it's very fragmented. There isn't a complete picture. That's really hard to find. When I went to the APMC markets, it was really hard to know who the intermediaries were representing. Some of the farmers that were selling it at those markets directly that weren't from the government, they didn't know who the traders were representing and where their exports were actually going in terms of the larger corporate penetration.
So thanks so much to the presenters that really did very well in spite of the constraints, and of course to everyone that took part here. A pleasure. See you at dinner.